Okay, welcome back to Psychology with Mr. Snyder. Today we're going to be talking about how psychology is a science, why it's a science, and how psychologists conduct scientific research. So your learning targets for today are to identify and describe the 5 basic steps of scientific research, and then to identify and describe 2 additional steps beyond the scientific method that psychologists and scientists must do. So, your steps of psychology. And why is psychology a science? We use the same general procedure when conducting research as other scientists, and it's 5 steps. It's the scientific method. And in psychology, we do it because researchers want to see only what is really there and not what their biases might want them to see. So we use the scientific method, which is a system for reducing bias and error in the measurement of data. And our first step is to form a research question. Research questions are focused on behavior rather than constructs that cannot be seen or measured directly. And we'll talk about constructs later. But for example, behavior you may witness is that you've noticed your younger siblings seem to get a little more aggressive with each other after watching a particularly violent children's cartoon program on Saturday morning. You wonder if the violence in the cartoon could be creating the aggressive behavior in your siblings. This step is derived from the goal, the psychological goal we talked about in chapter 1 of description. What is happening here? So once you have your once you have your question, you want your answer. So the next logical step is to form a tentative answer or explanation for the behavior that you have seen, and that's known as the hypothesis. So you form an educated guess about the explanation for your observations, putting it into some form of a statement that can be tested in some way. So in the example we're using, you may say, children who watch violent cartoons will become more aggressive. That is forming your hypothesis. The third step is actually to test the hypothesis. People have a tendency to notice only things that agree with their view of the world, and that selective perception is called confirmation bias. So if you're seeking out evidence to prove yourself right, you're not going to turn around and seek out evidence to prove yourself wrong. You're going to ignore that. That's confirmation bias. The scientific method we use is designed to overcome the tendency to look at only the information that confirms people's biases by forcing them to actively seek out information that might contradict their biases. So when you test your hypothesis, you are trying to determine if the factor you suspect has an effect and that the results weren't due to luck or chance. So the method you use to test your hypothesis will depend on exactly what kind of answer you think you'll get, and we'll go over methods of observation later in this chapter. But in the example, the best method would probably be an experiment in which you select a group of children, show half of them a cartoon with violence and half of them a cartoon with no violence, and then find some way of measuring aggressive behavior. And you'd have to come up with a construct of what aggressive behavior is. Like, is it hitting? Is it hitting with a sword? You'd have to come up with an operational definition, because if you have 3 researchers observing the behavior, they could all have a different idea of what aggression is. Your fourth step is to analyze the results. So once you know the results of your hypothesis testing, you have to figure out what your findings mean. And you need to look for patterns or relationships in the data, and we call those correlations, and we'll go over correlations later. But basically, you have to figure out, was your hypothesis supported or was it not supported? And if it wasn't supported, you need to go back to square one and think of another possible explanation for what you have observed. So could it be that Saturday mornings make children a little more aggressive? Maybe they slept longer. Maybe they had something sugary for breakfast. All of these could be affecting the results of your study. Lastly, we draw conclusions. You have to draw conclusions about your research question and the hypothesis. And basically, when the observations do not support the hypothesis, they change the theories or beliefs from which the hypothesis was derived. So keep an open mind. Just because an experiment didn't work doesn't mean a psychologist was necessarily wrong. They just weren't on the right track at first. Sounds kind of like a cop-out, but that's the way it is. You need to keep trying and figure out the real reason to your problem. Don't let your biases get in the way. So the steps of scientific research in a graphic for you. Come up with a research question. Come up with a hypothesis. Test your hypothesis. Analyze your results. Draw conclusions. If you were wrong, you either reject and revise your hypothesis, and that usually leads to, even if you're right, it usually leads to additional hypotheses. And then lastly, you can draw a theory from your experiment. And at that point, we get into the next two steps, known as, the first one is replication. So for the findings of a study to be confirmed, you have to report the results. And in a scientific journal, in a psychological journal, you must report the results, whether the hypothesis was right or wrong. That way, other psychologists can replicate your research. It must be repeated and produce the same results as before. If you repeat the study and don't get the same results, something changed and it ruins your entire theory. Some scientists may also repeat a study under different circumstances. Maybe they will show cartoons to a kid after school on Monday and see if that increases the violence. Different set of circumstances, different day, different time, but still the same experiment. You could also use a different set of participants, a different race, age, social and economic background, location. Maybe this doesn't happen in other parts of the world. Maybe it's an American thing. But that is the point of replication. The more it can be replicated and the more it produces the same result, the more your theory is solid. It's more concrete when that can happen. The next step, or the last step, is it usually leads to new questions. So why does viewing violence make children more violent? That's a new question. If we know that it does, why does it do that? Does it trigger something in the brain? Is it just observational behavior? And if kids are looking at it, does it make them want to do it? Different research methods can be used to test hypotheses. We can do a survey and ask kids if they get more violent after seeing a video game or watching a cartoon. And we'll talk about the different observational and testable methods later on this chapter. But that's all I have for you today. Steps of scientific research, very important to know, probably review from your other science classes, but I will see you later. Thanks for watching.